It's our privilege to have Dr. Doug Hardy with us tonight. And when I saw the title of his lecture for a Nazarene pastor's kid, I began to think about the ways that perhaps place, feeling grounded in a particular location, has been something that I perhaps don't understand. I remember being drawn into thinking about this when I was visiting St. Gregory's Monastery a couple years ago and talking to one of the novitiates. And they talked about part of the process of entering into the monastery there was taking what they call a vow of stability. That all the Benedictines who enter into the monastery out at St. Greg's take this vow of stability, where essentially they're saying when they say yes to the process, it means that their whole goal then in life is to end up in the cemetery that sits right there beside the church. And they talked about this vow of stability in this way that they said, you know, it's human nature for us to always think the grass is greener. For us to always want to wander to the place that we think holds more promise. And there's this way that the vow of stability reminds us that God is at work right here, that God's grace can sustain us. And so they have a deep sense of place. Also led me into thinking about how fortunate we are in the psychology department to be members of a department where faculty who have gone before us have also had a very deep sense of place. I think about the recently retired Dr. Stacer, and I think she ended up with 36 years of service to SNU. And what a deep sense of place she had, and how fortunate we are because of her faithfulness. I also think of Dr. Ladd, Forrest Ladd, who spent 40 years here at SNU. And again, what a wonderful opportunity is for us to be a part of that kind of history, where we have faculty members who have devoted themselves to a place, to an institution, and have faithfully given in that kind of way so that we kind of have the opportunity to stand on their shoulders. And in fact, you know, the Ladd Lectures are titled the Ladd Lectures in part because of the faithfulness of Dr. Forrest Ladd, who's here tonight. Dr. Ladd, I always say this, if we had a chapel, Dr. Ladd would be one of our stained glass windows, right? Because, you know, your stained glass windows, you put your icons, right? And I feel like Dr. Ladd is one of the icons for us that reminds us of the faithfulness of place. So Dr. Ladd, would you mind standing and let us recognize and thank you for your graciousness in supporting us. Our speaker for tonight is Dr. Doug Hardy. Doug is professor of spiritual formation, as well as the director of the Doctor of Ministry programs at Nazarene Theological Seminary. Doug has lived a life of mashups. Graduated with a triple major from Eastern Nazarene College, philosophy, theology, and psychology. He then went off and did a master's of counseling at Northeastern University in Boston, but that wasn't enough. So then he went off to Pasadena, California to do a master's in theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. Then went off to pastor for 8 years in Berkeley, California, and then ended back on faculty at ENC, teaching in the psychology department there, where he then began a doctorate and finished a doctorate in psychology of religion from Boston University. He's been at Nazarene Theological Seminary for 13 years now, and Doug will bring lots of wisdom in the ways that he has faithfully mashed up psychology and spiritual formation in ways that will benefit us all. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Hardy?
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you, Dr. Ladd, again, for sponsoring the lecture. Thank you, Ron, for your kind invitation to join with you all. Thank you, faculty, students who have taken time today to hang out with me a little bit. I've enjoyed our discussions in class and outside of class, and over meals. What a wonderful expression of community. A community grounded in place. I've been looking forward to this for a number of reasons, but one of them is to come back to Bethany. Been here a few times and have a little bit of a sense of the significance and meaning of this place to you as well as to many other people. Now, if this had been a few years ago, I probably would have booked a Southwest flight. But as some of you know, Southwest discontinued their direct flight from Kansas City to Oklahoma City. And so now the only way to get to Oklahoma City from Kansas City by air is to go quite a distance to some other hub and then back. So it really makes driving sort of a logical choice, which is not a bad thing actually, because I do quite a bit of flying. And I must say that even the trip down yesterday, driving down through the Flint Hills of Kansas and into northern Oklahoma and into the OKC metro area and into Bethany, reminds me and gives me a chance to experience again a sense of place that in our world we often lose sensitivity to. So, as we begin, let me just state real succinctly my basic assumption coming into this lecture and where I'm going, and then we'll dive in. In our contemporary global, virtual, and consumer society, physical place and spaces have a contested nature, intersecting with certain Gnostic spiritual tendencies. Drawing on minority but rising voices in the disciplines of psychology and theology, I argue for the often overlooked importance of physical place. And I will try to emphasize its critical formational value for Christian discipleship, especially as it fosters embodied practices. Okay, that's the nutshell. Now, to enter into it a little more anecdotally and autobiographically. I've been interested in place for a long time. And some of it reflects, I suppose, maybe my own personality, a little bit of my history. I grew up in Eastern Canada, went off to college in New England, ended up involved in graduate studies and pastoral ministry in California, both Southern and Northern California. Back to New England again in the major urban area of Boston. And now I'm in Kansas City, right in the middle of the country. So I've had a lot of opportunity to reflect on place. And as I have moved and traveled and tried to stay connected to different places, I've come to appreciate the power of place, which is the title of a book, one of the early writings on this topic by Winifred Gallagher. And I remember when I came across that book and first read it, it provided for me some language and some conceptual tools for more deeply reflecting on my own experience. In anticipation of talking to you, I've just even taken a little time to reflect on these last couple of months in my life, because this truly is an ongoing thing. In January, I was attending a conference in northern New Mexico, and there was a little pre-conference event that I had signed up for that was held at a place called Ghost Ranch. Anybody hear of that? Ghost Ranch. Wonderful place in northern New Mexico, tucked right into the mountains. It's actually owned and operated currently by the Presbyterian Church, USA. And this is the view as we were driving in. I love the mountains. I love the various western landscapes. And as we were driving in, I had heard that there is a rock formation called Chimney Rock. And I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but off in the distance. So I'm driving in, and I see it, and it already evokes something in me. And I'm already thinking, I gotta see this. I want to get there. The power of place. Fortunately for me, from my perspective, the next day, due to weather, one of the events was canceled that we were supposed to go out and do, so I had free time. And I discovered there was a Chimney Rock Trail. And so I set out, never having been there before, but drawn by this rock. And as I set out on the trail and got a little bit closer, it began to get a little bit closer until finally I was getting really close. You can see the top, and then at the end, the reward that always comes when you do something like this. This is what I got to see. The power of place. The power of place to catch our attention, to evoke things in us, and to invite us on journeys that we may not have set out on otherwise. Last month, traveled to southern New Jersey for a family funeral. This was an aunt of my wife's. And after the funeral, we went to a graveyard. This is a graveyard where there's some other family members buried, and you may notice on the grave sign reference to the country of Estonia. My wife's family is from the country of Estonia. And this graveyard in southern New Jersey is primarily filled with gravestones marking people who emigrated to this country from both Germany and Estonia following World War II. So, had just been at a family funeral, and you know a little bit of what family funerals can be like. They're important times for storytelling, for reconnecting, for memory sharing. But honestly, as good as the funeral experience was, the highlight for me was afterwards we went to the graveyard. Again, the power of place. Not just seeing the gravestones, but as we stood around, the power of place took effect again. And there were conversations that happened in the graveyard that wouldn't have happened back at the funeral service, because of the uniqueness of that physical place and all of the meaning invested in it. An opportunity to share stories, to point out things in reference to the physical markers right there in the ground. Just last week, I traveled to Birmingham, Alabama for another conference, and had the opportunity while I was there to visit the Civil Rights Institute Museum in downtown Birmingham. And right across from it is the 16th Street Baptist Church. And some of you may realize the strategic importance of the city of Birmingham in the civil rights movement in this country. And I had an opportunity to revisit some of that and to listen and to learn. So this is just a photo I took inside the 16th Street Baptist Church. The woman who's standing there is a woman and author, Carolyn McKinstry, who was a young person in 16th Street Baptist Church on that Sunday, September 15th, 1963, when a bomb went off in that church, killing 4 young African-American girls. Part of the terrorism of this horrific period in our country's history. So she was there. Those 4 girls were her friends. So she's telling us the stories and talking about her involvement and experience of the civil rights movement. And I need to tell you that I could have heard her give that talk in a lecture hall somewhere. You know, I could have accessed it maybe on YouTube, but standing in 16th Street Baptist Church, seeing the place where the bomb went off, evoked a power that otherwise would not have been possible. Also, while we're at that conference, we had a worship service in the chapel at Beeson Divinity School, which is on the campus of Samford University. And Timothy George, who is the dean of Beeson School of Divinity, gave a powerful sermon. And he's talking in his sermon based on the book of Revelation about the communion of saints. He's talking about the witness of the saints and how we are all tied into this incredible community as Christians that stretches back across time. Now, again, I could have heard that message in a number of different settings, but while I was hearing it, this is what I got to look at when I raised my head. This is what, in this chapel, which actually was just built about 15 years ago, it's a very recent chapel, this is what they put in to give physical expression to this reality. By the way, John Wesley's up there. And then on a more mundane level, the hotel that I was staying at in Birmingham, I had this just funny experience. When I sometimes hotel rooms can be kind of dark. So I first walked in, and when I first turned on the light in the bathroom and walked in, my first response was, "Oh my goodness, what are all these sheets of toilet paper doing on the floor?" They're tiles. But even though I knew that and I registered that cognitively for my entire stay there, every time I walked into that bathroom, I was startled and a little bit disconcerted that something was on the floor that didn't belong there. The power of place. Well, I suspect that maybe as you've even been listening to some of my stories, you've had opportunity to think about places in your own life and the power of place and the things that maybe various kinds of places have evoked for you. And yet, if that is true, if at some level existentially we know this, why is it that we often, in fact, neglect or at least undervalue the power of place as a formative influence? I think there's a number of reasons. Personally and culturally, let's start there. One would be that the influence of place is not something that's always obvious. It surrounds us. It's there. It's having an impact, but we're just not always consciously aware of it. We don't notice it. Also, living as we are in a society that is very much the product of modernity, we have all been subjected to universalizing tendencies. Tendencies that in many ways dull our awareness of and appreciation for the particularities of place. And as someone who travels a fair bit, I experience this in airports all the time, in hotels, in restaurant chains. And I put up here just a little picture of news, Do you ever notice that the news anchor teams, you could transfer them to almost any city in the country and they do just fine? The sets are pretty much the same. The approach is pretty much the same. Most of the distinctive regional accents have been weaned out. And certainly for all of us in this day and age, the widespread use of digital, virtual technologies has in many ways flattened out our sense of place. We, more than ever, can connect in truly important ways but in ways that leave out the particularities of place. In fact, one of the things we're wrestling with now is even the question, so is like virtual space like really a place now? And is it a place in the same way as physical places are, right? And what do we do with that? Mostly, by the way, unanswered questions that I think we have yet to do much more wrestling with. But what about the discipline of psychology? Overall, the discipline of psychology has not dealt very much with the power of place. And there's some reasons for that too. Historically, psychology focuses on, and frankly, privileges persons, individual persons especially, their behaviors and their internal world. That's the main interest and preoccupation of the discipline. Also, especially in psychodynamic psychology, when the language of place and space is used, it's usually metaphorical, right? So referring to ultimately our internal or relational worlds, not actual physical locations. And the discipline of psychology for some time now has been, and I think is still largely caught up with the current zeitgeist of fascination with physiology and the brain. And there's so much there to engage us that, again, it keeps us looking inward. Well, what about Christian theology? What about discipleship? One of my observations, and something that has concerned me for some time, is our disengagement often with place as an important factor theologically and in terms of discipleship. Again, a lot of reasons for that. Certainly in the Christian tradition, especially in the West, we've had ambivalence about the subject of place. We have mixed feelings about it because there is a real tension, and you see this in Scripture, for example. So on the one hand, place is important, and this is reflected in what is often referred to as the cataphatic tradition in Christian spirituality, that tradition that values what we can see and imagery and what we can sense. And in that sense, place is important. And if you were to take out all the place names in the Bible, you'd have a pretty significantly reduced Scripture, wouldn't we? But on the other hand, there's also this emphasis on placelessness in the Scriptures, and that is reflected in what's called the apophatic tradition in Christianity. And so, think of Jesus' words to the woman at the well, remember she was saying, well, don't you have to be in this place to worship? Some people say you worship here, and Jesus says, well, the time is coming, and actually is here, when all worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. Right? And that almost sort of suggests that, well, maybe place is no longer a part of the equation anymore. So we're not sure about that. And as Protestants, there's other dynamics that come into play. Historically, the Protestant Reformation, of course, emphasizes God's transcendence and has had accompanying iconoclastic tendencies. That is, we're uncomfortable with imagery, with things that are too physically anchored. And actually, there are periods of our history when we have deliberately destroyed those things. And the priority still, in many sectors of the Protestant world, is on spoken and written communication. That's where the real stuff happens. Right? In evangelicalism, particularly thinking of coming out of the 20th century, discipleship has often been framed in primarily cognitive categories. Again, what do you believe? What do you know? What can you articulate? And you can do that anywhere. I mean, doesn't matter your location, doesn't matter your surroundings, really. And of course, those traditions within Christianity that do actually take the surroundings more seriously, think Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, we're often, not always sure we really agree with that. and sometimes want to distinguish ourselves. And then one final piece that I think is very much at play nowadays, and this connects with my mentioning Gnosticism earlier, and that is spirituality is often posited as antithetical to the material physical world. So it's my spirit versus my body. It's spirituality versus materiality. And to the extent that that really drives how we think about things, of course, place is not going to be a significant factor because it's material. And so what we often end up doing is spiritualizing place. Well, in light of all this, I think there's compelling reasons why we really need to pay attention to the power of place now. Give it special attention, in fact. We are experiencing a human crisis of place with the high mobility of Western cultures, with global displacement of peoples through war and famine, and the destruction of the natural environment through pollution and misuse and mismanagement of natural resources. We also, I think, need some help confronting the increasing dominance of the virtual world with its claims that drive us towards deplacement. More, and you, in fact, there's a place where we can see this is in higher education, right? So more and more, we are being told you can learn, and what you need to really learn doesn't really have to be connected with a place. Now again, this is something that's debatable, and it's being argued, and it's contestable, but we need to be aware of that it's a claim that's being made. And it's a significant claim too, by the way, because it's got economic force behind it. The money now, and those of you in higher ed know this, and you know, the money now is behind deplaced learning for all kinds of reasons. So we just need to not be naive about this. My sense is that younger generations in particular are beginning to be hungry for a spirituality that connects with their concerns for the environment. A spirituality that's connected with taking physical place seriously, with healthy food production, for example, and consumption, and a renewed concern for aesthetic beauty. A spirituality that is located only or ultimately internally tends to view that which is external, including one's own skin, as a distraction at best or an enemy at worst. The contemporary spiritual formation movement, I think, is beginning to try to correct some of these oversights by taking more seriously the human body and embodied spirituality. Many of you I know recognize that term and are already committed to try to learn about that and to live into it. It seems to me, though, that we may be at a point where the spiritual formation movement needs to go to the next level. Okay? Taking our human bodies seriously, but taking just as seriously the physical environment. Or another way that I often find myself thinking about this is, as Christians, we're committed to lots of different bodies. We're committed to the literal, physical body, incarnated body of Jesus Christ, Son of God, and our practices of the Lord's Supper affirm that. We're committed to the body of Christ, right? We're committed to this body being a temple of the Holy Spirit. But I I think we also need to be seriously considering the ways in which the earth is a body, and it's our body. So place and space, inexorably connected to the spiritual life, taking them seriously as part of a holistic understanding of Christian spiritual formation. Well, we've got some good guides to help us. One of the things that has happened within very recent times is there's a growing literature now on theology and spirituality of place. And these are just some of the titles that I'm hoping will catch your attention and maybe some of your interest. Belden Lane, The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, Exploring Desert and Mountain Spirituality. Spaces for the Sacred by Philip Sheldrake. A Christian Theology of Place by John Inge. These are all really significant, substantive texts that make a case for why we need to take place seriously. Interesting book based on Paul Jensen's doctoral dissertation at Fuller Seminary, Subversive Spirituality, Transforming Mission Through the Collapse of Space and Time. And he's particularly wrestling with some of the developments culturally whereby literally space and time are collapsing in our digital virtual world, and probing us on the implications of that for our spiritual lives. Where Mortals Dwell, A Christian View of Place Today by Craig Bartholomew. And then The Space Between, a Christian engagement with the built environment. So notice that when we're talking about place and space, we're not only talking about the natural landscapes, although we certainly are, but also the human involvement and engagement in building things and creating spaces. Eric Jacobson, by the way, is a pastor in Seattle. He writes this book and takes the readers on a tour through some of the churches in the Seattle area. There's a whole lot of stuff in those books, as you might imagine, but the basic point is this. We've tended to think about Christian spirituality as primarily a relationship between God and people, right? That's kind of the heart of it. And what these authors are arguing for is that actually if we're careful with our biblical exegesis, we have to acknowledge it's really a trifold reality, that it's always a relationship between God, a people, and place. The place piece gets dropped out for a number of the reasons that I think I've suggested. Now, by the way, you may know this, but there are many parts of the world, and there are many people living in this country who come from other parts of the world for whom this is the air they breathe. And they would say, of course. So some of this applies maybe to us who have been more highly westernized, right? God, people, place. The literature calls us to remember the importance of the Genesis creation story, the importance of the land in Israel's history, the concrete places in Palestine where Jesus walked and taught. Just try taking Jesus' words and extract them from the places where he taught them. And you've already watered down the gospel. The urban and wilderness environments that shaped the developments of the early church, both in its parish forms and in its monastic forms. Well, there's a bunch of themes that are dealt with here, and I'm going to need to not explore these in any detail tonight for the reasons of time, but let me just mention the categories. Belonging, place and belonging, place and commitment, place and landscape, place and memory, place and narrative, place and conflict. Now, just thinking about those categories, can you see how this is pertinent to being a student of psychology? Because theologically, what all this tends to point to is the importance of the particular. Now, again, remember, part of our cultural heritage is an emphasis on universalizing, an ignoring of the particular. And this is connected with the doctrine of the incarnation. 13th century Franciscan theologian Duns Scotus argued that the incarnation reveals God's eternal intention to create everything in its specificity, or what he termed its thisness. And he affirmed this. You would expect this from a Franciscan, by the way. Each element of God's creation is an aspect of revelation. It reveals God. So, to put it bluntly, when we stop paying attention to place, we stop paying attention to the fullness of God's revelation. Pretty serious stuff. Well, what about psychology? Inge, in his book, says this: the New Testament material would suggest, therefore, that a high view of place flows from the incarnation, and that place is important psychologically. He's writing as a theologian. Okay? Psychologically and eschatologically, as well as physically. The final promise in the New Testament and in the Old is of placedness. In 1977, David Cantor, an architectural psychologist, published a little book called The Psychology of Place, which really started to probe these areas. Not much happened with it. Psychology as a whole didn't pick up on it, didn't have much interest in it at that time. It had other fish to fry, and there was a long period of pretty much silence. But in more recent times now, there's been sort of the beginnings of a bubbling up of signs that psychologists are starting to take this issue of place more seriously. So, for example, an article by a well-known psychoanalyst, Anna Maria Rizzuto, she shares a case study in which part of the treatment was her recognizing that for this young woman that she was treating, that there were actual physical places in this person's life that had to be taken very seriously and not just metaphorized. In particular, a relative's home. She talks about this in quite detail. A church, interesting enough. And we're not just talking about, the preaching in the church. We're talking about the actual church building, the physical experience that this patient had in church. And then ultimately, which I think is an important invitation for anybody doing psychodynamic clinical work, to pay attention to your actual office space where you're meeting with the person. Another interesting study done by some neurobiologists measuring the connection between specific physical landscapes and the human activity of listening to the sounds that have been recorded at different kind of landscapes in different settings, and some interesting findings that point actually to statistically significant differences between the kinds of brain wave responses from listening to recordings that were made at what have been deemed sacred sites versus ordinary sites. And the listeners didn't know the difference. Sacred spaces in healthcare. Most hospitals, as you know, have some kind of chaplaincy program and chapels. And so there's been some interesting research now being done on the role of sacred spaces in healthcare. the importance of design and how people are interacting and responding to those places as it relates to other aspects of physical health. And then coming out of the fields of child placement practice, social workers and psychologists are beginning to recognize that when they talk about the social environment and social influences in social psychology, it's not enough to just focus on the interpersonal dynamics going on and the social environment, but to take seriously the ways that physical dimensions of the natural environment are shaping spiritual experience. A couple of publications that, if you want to look further into this, you might find to be of interest. The Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality has some chapters that focus on spiritual development during childhood and adolescence, spirituality, science, and the human body, constructing the connection between spirituality, work, and family, and a post-materialist human science and its implications for spiritual activism. In all of these chapters, they're pointing out the ways in which consciousness as the fabric of the reality allows for a universe with guiding intention that is inherently teleological and in which all ground is sacred. Okay? This is the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality. These are written by people in the fields of psychology, not theology. And then probably one of the most promising developments in terms of ongoing research is the subfield of psychology that has traditionally been known as environmental psychology, but which has evolved into what is now embodied in APA Division 34, which is the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology. And they published just a couple of years ago a handbook that has chapters that deal with human behavior and well-being related to the design of built spaces, landscapes, and natural environments, conservation of wildlife and other species, synergies between human mental health and the ecology of the natural environment, the psychological consequences of high population density, etc., etc., etc. Well, there are two Greek words for place. And I think the difference between these two words kind of captures what is at stake as we consider how we might want to proceed with all of this stuff. Many of us have inherited from our study of psychology, perhaps, from the theologies that have shaped and formed us, from our experience in church, an understanding of place that is basically topos. Place as inert. It's a neutral container. It's just the place I happen to be. So the cafeteria is, that's the place where you just go to eat, right? So, and it just happens to be the place, and I don't particularly pay too much attention to it. Church is the container where I go to do worship, but the real aspects and functions of worship aren't connected to the actual place. But the other Greek word, chora, understands place as actually having its own vitality. That place actually has a presence about it that generates meaning in participation with those who dwell there. Another way to say it is that those of us who take seriously, because of our theological commitments, because of our psychological commitments, those of us who take seriously relationality need to extend that dynamic beyond just other people to the places where we live and move and have our being. And in fact, the word dwell points towards a kind of relationship to place that is more than just passing through. So, where you live, your home, do you dwell there? Just because you spend time there doesn't mean you actually dwell. Do you dwell at SNU? I mean, when you're on campus, are you dwelling here? Because you don't have to. When you go to church, do you dwell there? And what might that be? Well, there's a whole case study that I don't have time to go into tonight, but I want to alert you to in case, again, this is something you might want to look at more closely. Thomas Merton, that pretty well known and significantly influential 20th century Christian contemplative. Probably one of the most significant and impactful spiritual writers from the Christian tradition in the 20th century, honestly. Spent the early part of his life largely homeless. His parents both died at a very young age, and even when they were alive, they traveled all over and kind of took him with them. And he never had like a home or a neighborhood or sort of a place that he kind of identified with, and that kind of restlessness and sort of lack of rootedness went with him through his young adult years. And eventually, he had a significant conversion experience that he wrote about in a book called The Seven-Story Mountain. Here it is. The Seven-Story Mountain. And then out of that conversion experience, he felt called to become a monk. Converted to Roman Catholicism and wanted to go to the monastery. And in an article written by Belden Lane called Merton's Heritage, Bachelard, French philosopher, Domestic Space and Spiritual Transformation in the journal Spiritus, Lane sort of describes how Thomas Merton's movement from being a kind of unrooted young person into the stable world of the monastery in Gethsemane, Kentucky, a Trappist monastery, kind of began to root him and give him a sense of placeness and being at home. But one of the things that happened was while he was in the monastery in Gethsemane, I think I've got a picture of it. Yeah, while he was in the monastery, he became a famous, well-known writer, in part because of Seven-Story Mountain. I mean, it hit the top of the charts on the New York Times bestsellers list. And so he became a celebrity monk. kind of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so over time, what he found was that even though initially being in the monastery was really addressing important needs that he had to anchor himself in that vow of stability in place, that dynamically he was accruing a false self. He was accruing a public persona that the place of the monastery actually was reinforcing. And he started to get restless again and realized that this is not it. So what he ended up, and he became aware of a growing longing to spend more time in solitude. And so there's a tradition in monasticism of living as a hermit in a hermitage. And so over a period of years, with permission from his abbot, he actually built a little hut on the edge of the monastery property, started spending more time there, and eventually, for the last couple of years of his life before a tragic, untimely death, he lived as a hermit. And in this article, Belden Lane describes how the hermitage, he says, would prove crucial in Merton's imaginative work of contemplating a new self before God. That the stripping away of his false public persona, religious self, only was possible because he changed his physical location and submitted to the discipline of living life in a hermitage. Now, he had to do heart work. His attitude, cognitive processes, all those things played a role, but it's clear that he had to move. The place also had a significant influence. Bachelard, the French philosopher, argues that the experience of solitude in a contained space is psychologically conducive to the emergence of a new identity. So we don't just change our identity by saying to ourselves, I think I'll become a new person today. Or, I want to become a new person today. Therefore, I am now a new person. It doesn't happen that way. We need to be formed and shaped by many things, and place, strategic place, is one of those. So, in closing, Lane says, it's crucially important that we continually ask questions. And I think that's really where we are culturally right now with respect to this. We have more questions than answers, but those questions are important. We need to be continually asking questions about the function of place in the formation of spiritual identity. We are what our places make of us. They not infrequently prod and entice us into unexpected transformations of being. So I'm going to leave you with two questions that hopefully will enable you to reflect about place in your life. The first one, what are the places, and again, I'm literally talking about physical places here, so don't use this metaphor. What are the places that enslave you? Now, isn't it interesting that for Thomas Merton, the place of enslavement was a monastery? Now, that doesn't mean there was an inherent enslaving dynamic in the monastery, because this was his journey. But places have potential to form and shape us in different directions. What are the places that enslave you, that squelch you? Facilitating, in effect, the work of sin in your life. Even if that sin is constructing a false self, a public persona behind which you hide. Conversely, what are the places that free you to imagine? That free you to resist? Merton had to make some pretty tough choices to leave the monastery. That was not easy for him. And again, as I think back to my brief visit to Birmingham, Alabama, think about the history of the civil rights movement in this country and what are still some of the ongoing challenges in race relations here in this country. We need Christians who know how to resist evil. And the kinds of places where we spend time will influence our capacity to be able to resist. In effect, what are the places that facilitate the work of God in your life? And I think that the spiritual formation implication of this could be summarized this way. Beware. So this is a word of warning. Beware of places that enslave you with a surface falsity. And embrace places that free you. To imagine, to resist, and to be true. And a second question for reflection. What are the places that call you to the discipline of remaining? Ron, mentioned so appropriately that vow of stability. What are the places that call you to the discipline of remaining? Staying with. And in so doing, losing yourself for the sake of others. One of the things that monasteries do as sacred places is they tend to strip people, in this case, Christians. Monasteries are a form of intentional Christian community. They strip people of their spiritual fantasies pretty quickly. But, of course, because monasteries are occupied by human beings, once you get through that, you can start to develop other kinds of fantasies and illusions as a super spiritual monk, which is what happened to Thomas Merton. And so he needed to find another place where he had to re-go through a whole new discipline of staying. And believe me, staying in that hermitage was not an easy task for him. But he did it not just for his own personal well-being, but he realized that in his vocation as a prayer and as a writer, an influential writer, he knew that he could not be the writer God wanted him to be for the sake of the world unless he submitted to the discipline of living in that hermitage. What are your fantasies about what it means to be a Christian? The spiritual formation implication. Again, a word of warning. Beware. Beware of places that seduce you into a fantasy world of serving yourself alone. This can happen almost anywhere. I mean, if it can happen in a monastery, surely it can happen at a Christian university. And it can happen at a theological seminary. Beware. And constructively, embrace places that teach you how to relinquish for the sake of the common good. May the Lord help us all. Thank you very much.
We have some time for some questions, so feel free to fire away with thoughts or comments or questions.
What places are significant for you?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Next. No, I know. One of the good things, by the way, about doing a lecture like this is it's a great discipline because it's hard to hide. And it's important that we not hide. Places that are important for me. Actually, my home is one of those places. And it's taken on different meanings in different seasons of life. But I remember a critical point when I was a parent of 3 young children. And one of my fantasies was that the ultimate in spiritual formation was sitting quietly by myself in a candlelit room with soft music playing in the background, communing with God in prayer. That's not a bad place to be, actually, so I'm being a little facetious. But what it took me a little while to realize was that really, for me, was one of those fantasies that was pulling me away from where God was actually calling me to form me as a person who could deepen my capacity to love God and my neighbor. Because that place was, especially for those years, literally at home with my wife and with my children. Spending time with them and sharing physical spaces with them in their world. Now, as I'm older, my kids are all up and out, and there's a certain aspect of emptiness. But my wife's mother came to live with us 3 years ago, and she has advancing Alzheimer's. I'm hearing the call again. So again, you know, I mean, I have my fantasies about the way I'd like to use my home at this season in my life. Wouldn't it be nice if I could come home every day and fill in the blank? But you know what? Right now, again, in a new and different way, it's really important that I be there sufficiently enough for my mother-in-law and for my wife, who is grieving the slow death of her mother. Yeah. And so, I can't do that from a distance. And if my commitments to my other places, like my workplace, or where I go to hang out with my friends and all that, it takes too much of a priority, then I'm living in a fantasy world where God is just going to be blocked from shaping me more deeply in love. So probably home is a key place for me. There's others too, but that's one.
I used to sit in Dr. Ladd's classes years ago, and over the years, now that I have grandchildren, we go out to eat with our kids and our grandchildren and see our technological world where you've got small children, the age of my grandchildren, sitting there with electronic devices, and there is no interconnection going on around a dinner table at a Panera Bread or Starbucks. How do all these young kids, how do those of us in our age bracket, how do we impact that world that is already, my grandchildren, I couldn't figure out how to turn on my son's new 64-inch high-definition TV the other night, and my granddaughter, who's 6, 7, 8, whatever she is, pulled it and said, "Here, Grandpa, let me show you." Bang, 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 and she's done. Wait, come on, honey, come home and program our new TV. But it's a real issue in today's world when you talk about disconnection.
Yeah. Disclaimer. I think it's too early to know. We really are working this out. So so I have no vantage point of true expertise to speak. But a couple of observations. One, it's a mixed bag, and we need to acknowledge it as such. When folks, and some of you do this, you're sitting around a table with other people and you're all on your devices. Most of you are still connecting. It's just you're not connecting to the people you're with, right? So we need to be careful to just about making overgeneralized statements here. It's like, well, people who sit with cell phones in their hand, smartphones or whatever, aren't interested in connecting. That's not true. But the danger, I think, again, is Gnosticism. So the urge to connect and the using the various kinds of social media means to do that is not in and of itself a bad thing. It opens up all kinds of interesting opportunities, actually. But to the extent that it's disconnected from being together in place, there's some things it just cannot do. And there's inherent dangers in it, even as there are inherent dangers of trying to connect with people when you're physically present with them, right? So we know, just throw a bunch of people in a room together, doesn't mean you're going to have wonderful things come out of that. So some of it is, we're now dealing with multiple environments around different kinds of connecting, and we're trying to sort through that. Now, the second observation would be this. In some ways, you got to fight fire with fire, if that's an apt analogy. That is to say, you address disconnection from place by providing meaningful connection with place. So part of the problem, for example, is that most restaurants want you to be on your device, quite honestly. In fact, I was at New York LaGuardia Airport in one of my travels recently. Have you been there? Any of you been there lately? Man, every single restaurant and lounge in the whole place now has a tablet attached to the table. So you sit down, it's staring you in the face. So this is where again, like I said, there's a huge economic engine behind all this. Let's not be deceived. So part of it is we might need to rethink things like, where do we go out to eat? Is that, maybe what used to work really well in just going to a restaurant, getting a table together and sitting around, is not going to work in quite the same way as it did before. One of the things that really is of interest to me is that more and more of my students now are getting together with their friends to cook a meal. To cook a meal. Because part of what that does is it gauges you with place in a whole different way. The kitchen, for example, right? So another example this morning in History and Systems of Psychology class. We were talking about this morning. I was just struck that nobody in the class this morning had a laptop out. And part of it was the specific way that the classroom was designed and the way the classroom was run. So so the pull of the digital screen is huge. There's so much force and dynamic behind it. We need to acknowledge that, we need to take it seriously, but it means we need to counter it with something that has equal or greater power. And so part of what we're being forced to re-examine, I think, is some of our most deepest commitments and values and beliefs around these things.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but as far as in the field of psychology, how does the dynamic of space creation play with this idea of space affection, or the affective nature of space?
Could you say a little bit more about that? I'm not sure I'm catching the question.
Okay, so you stated that there's been a somewhat disregard for the psychology field to pay attention to space.
Okay.
But then, how would you incorporate that in research as far as space creation in order to pay attention to space?
So what? Yeah. Well, certainly one of my hopes is that there will be a stronger research agenda, because that tends to be one of the ways that things move forward in the field of psychology. Right? Is that when it's the kind of thing that students want to do their projects on, when it's the kind of thing that faculty and researchers can get money for, research grants, and are pitching proposals for research grants, then that kind of builds interest in it and gives an opportunity for it to become on the radar screen more. So my hope is that some of these things, even that I was indicating, are sort of rising up, will create interest and some energy, and capture more attention. I don't know how well that answers your question, but
it was probably too large a question.
yeah. Do you want to come back at it though, and maybe focus in on a specific piece?
I don't think that it's that far developed.
Okay, that's fine.
I could stack the question.
Sure.
The question. Because I just kind of turned to them and asked them, like, what are the ways that you might start to quantify, like, engaging with space? Like, if research were something, if you were to do research on this, how would you even begin?
Sure. Some of it could probably be self-reported, right? So if it's, say, in an experimental design, you have people spending time in different kinds of physical environments, and then having some kind of self-report measure afterwards that then could be quantified on a scale. Physiological measurements, I think, is one of the key ways too, because that's become a growing way of gathering data in the psychology of religion. So, for example, some of the most interesting research on meditation, the positive value and effect of meditation as a practice, comes from brain scans of people who are meditating compared to those that aren't. So, so does the location where meditation is happening make a difference or not? I mean,
could go to appreciate silence.
Yes.
And it's just a very enriching program that I'm taking, and I just wanted to let you know we had that.
Good. Yeah.
Can you talk about strategies or experiences that you've had sort of sanctifying secular places? How to worship in an ugly church, how to appreciate, suburbia instead of Sedona, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that as we were driving to the restaurant tonight, and I saw another warehouse church. And of course, one of the, very seriously, one of the significant positive features of sort of grassroots missional Christianity is it'll go anywhere. And especially if the people on the margins do not have access to the more aesthetically pleasing places, which is usually the case, then typically the Christian response has not been to focus and center on the aesthetically pleasing places and try desperately to get the people on the margins to come. We go to where they are. Incarnation. And I think a Christian theology can help us here too, in the sense of if we really are being shaped and formed into a cruciform pattern, that following Jesus means not just happy resurrected Jesus, but we follow the crucified Christ who died and rose and will come again. Then we're not afraid of places that are characterized more by darkness than light, by poverty than richness. In that sense, I think Jesus, even with what we see recorded of his life in the Gospels, really redeems all places. There's this great poem that has this line in it: all pathways by your feet have been tread. Yeah, sort of. There's no pathway on earth. There's no alleyway. There's no building. There's no part of the natural environment where Jesus has not been there. So if we really take that seriously, then our first and foremost instinct is not to be judgmental or become elitist, but rather to take that place seriously as, think of concentration camps, think about Martin Luther King Jr. in a Birmingham jail. Think about people now who live on the edges of our cities, who get stuck closest to the airports, where all the noise pollution is, the industrial waste. And these are places where God is. And we are to join in embodying the presence of Jesus there. But part of what we do then is we take seriously that these are also places that have in no small part been shaped by injustice. And therefore, part of our being there is to consider, how can this place be changed? Not just spiritualized, right? Not just, let's have really good church services in these places so that people will feel somewhat content, or at least have one day a week they can feel happy till they get to heaven. but rather we say, no, we're now, so there's structural issues here. What can we do about it? There's architectural issues here. What can we do about it? There's infrastructure issues here. What can we do about it? There's not enough trees here. There are no gardens. What can we do about it?
I had a question about Morton. Was that his name?
Merton.
Merton.
Yeah, Thomas Merton.
I guess it's a question about dwelling and human person's ability to actually dwell for an extended amount of time. I think of like Buber and like his understanding of like the I thou and that it's sort of fleeting.
Yeah.
And I understand that the dwelling process is probably a discipline in that. But I guess I understand dwelling as that it only comes in moments, but that they're fleeting. So what can we say for people that truly want to dwell and don't want to live in a place where?
Well, so maybe there's two kinds of dwelling, right? So for Thomas Merton, for example, I probably the moments in which he felt like unusually high levels of being at peace, that's probably the minority. Most of the time, you wouldn't have felt that. In fact, this is the interesting paradox. He accelerated up several notches his engagement with global social justice issues as a writer after going to the Hermitage. Because he actually had space and the opportunity to be still enough, unbusy, undistracted, to be able to focus on. He could see the bombers flying overhead. This is the 1950s, early 60s. The retreat into solitude in the Hermitage was not a retreat into naivete. It wasn't sticking his head in the sand. It was opening up to a greater engagement with the world. So a lot of the time, he felt agony. So the discipline of dwelling was actually staying with that for the sake of the greater good of what God was calling me to do. So maybe there's a kind of dwelling that is, again, just more physically based dwelling, that you're just there. You stay there, you don't run away. As opposed to maybe the more psychological, existential dwelling as a happy mood state.
I got a question kind of similar to your answer there and then the answer before you gave. Wondering what kind of ecclesiological sort of structural implications there would be for us all as sort of a mainline Nazarene Protestant heritage.
Sure.
And sort of maybe constructive critiques that come into that kind of structure from sort of intentional community, radical Reformation movements where you're doing place together as a body daily, all parts of the day, rather than sort of going to a building and then going to different restaurants and then going to different homes. So you can see where I'm going.
Yeah, absolutely. So ecclesiologically, we want to take all of these considerations, and again, acknowledging a lot of this right at this point is questioning, not necessarily clear answers always. We want to look at it through the lens of Christian community. So what is the role of place in shaping and nurturing corporate identity? So maybe kind of like the question about the family in the restaurant, which I really appreciate that. That was a great question and maybe a helpful image for us, where we have to say, okay, we got an issue here. What is it about the restaurant that we need to pay attention to? Okay? Maybe we need to say, okay, we have some issues with church. So what is it about the church building that we need to pay attention to? Almost like going to church like a little bit as a researcher, you know, a little bit of ethnographic study. So what is our building like, and what does our building do to people, and how does what we do with the building and the place and the way we channel people and where they walk, or how does that affect and shape us? Because it's not neutral, right? It's not this topos. The church is not just a container. It's a presence with which we engage, and that forms and shapes us. So, and then maybe in response to asking those kinds of questions in our particular contextualized situations, maybe some things will emerge from that might indicate some possibilities for change. But it's based. It would be changes based on looking through the communal lens, not just what does church do for me, or what do I need church to be for me this week. Something some of us were discussing, I think it might have been at lunchtime, that I think is really important here is, I think an attention to place might actually be a way to help Christians get back into prayer more seriously as a practice of the Christian life. Because I think, for understandable reasons, much of our praying has become too Gnostic. That is to say, we kind of think it doesn't matter where we pray. And I mean, at some level, yeah, it's not like there's only one place you can pray, but that would be a dangerous thing, right? Say, if you're not in this place, you can't pray. But it's equally dangerous, I think, to say, well, you can pray anywhere. I don't think that's true. I mean, hypothetically, abstractly, maybe so, but we're not abstract beings. We're concrete individuals, which means we will be more likely to pray in some places than others. Do we take that seriously enough? I don't think so. And one of the things that I think the growth of Islam in this country is, in I hope a helpful way, may really help us, is they're challenging Christians to remember something we've forgotten. And that is, it used to be that the church, first and foremost, was a place where Christians gathered to pray. And for the most part, it's not anymore. So, might there be some things about our buildings and the way we view and use our buildings that could be changed, that would help us to pray more as a community? Wouldn't that be neat? Now that's not to say that just changing something in your building is automatically going to turn a community of Christians into a praying community, but it could be a strategic piece. If we take our embodiment seriously, if we take place seriously. And I suppose the same could be said about campuses too, right? Yeah, I think, in fact, I've often wondered, I think you're having a forum tonight that may be dealing with some of this, but sort of what really makes a Christian university distinctive? There's probably lots of different ways you can answer that. But I wonder if one of the ways that maybe we need to look at more carefully and closely if Christian universities are going to carry on into the remainder of this century is to say, is to be able to say at some level, well, one of the ways that Christian universities are different is actually we have different, our place is different. So I'm not just talking about the people who come here, because that certainly is a big, or just all the activities. That's a piece too. But if you were to clear everybody out for a day, and somebody were to walk onto the campus, would there be? I mean, what would be the indicators? So, And again, there are branches of our broad Christian tradition that have taken that more seriously, and particularly I think of the Roman Catholic and Orthodox branches, because their theology has been much more geared towards, they never really left behind the theology of place that Protestants have tended to jettison and that we're now confronting the dilemma with. So, yeah. Just think of it, a Christian university is a place. Maybe there's more we can do imaginatively.
That seems like a good place.
A good place to end.
Thank you for joining me. Yes, that's it.